For the purposes of the book you wrote, excellent book, very probably the most dense kind of information dense book on the subject that I've read. Very good. For the purposes of like what you were discussing, what is intel? Can you give us like a kind of like a basic definition of what intel is?
Yeah, and relation. Thanks for the comments about the book as well. There's a couple of features to it. I mean, intelligence, related to conflicts in and about Northern Ireland, and specifically British intelligence trying to infiltrate, etc., and disrupt the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Essentially, there's different wings to this. So at one part, you'd have, or different features. So you'd have like the human intelligence, and that would be a key. I would argue probably is the kind of key feature they lent upon to get information on the IRA. So there you're dealing with three different types of what British intelligence would call like human intelligence sources. So you've got what you call like army agents. So an agent is someone who essentially they're not part of a like paramilitary initially, but they might try and infiltrate it. So there's a couple of examples, like the person who goes by the pseudonym Kevin Fulton would be an example of that. Willie Carlin's another one who's released a book. They would go under that because they had a relationship with the army beforehand, and that's part of the reason they therefore like infiltrate the IRA. Then you've got what you could just say is agents. So examples of this would be people such as Raymond Gilmore, who was kind of a renowned supergrass in the early 80s in Derry. And the reason why Raymond Gilmore would be an agent, like he's not an IRA member before infiltrating the group for British intelligence. So yes, they have a different terminology. And then you've got your informers. So these are people who are members of the IRA in this specific case, and they're turning in a sense to work for British intelligence and providing information. So you've got that side of things, but which is the main thing my book focused on, just partly because that seemed to be the kind of main source of intelligence in terms of like what the army or the intelligence services in the UK would call like actionable intelligence, stuff that's given them, they always said like chapter and verse. So when you talk to like intelligence or army personnel, and what they meant by that was essentially people who could tell them what's happening, when it's happening, potentially why it's happening. Then if you look at other, and this partly then goes into the explanation when we look at other intelligence mediums, so such as your electronic intelligence, eavesdropping devices, etc. So that has a use for the intelligence services, and they, we talk about that in memoirs or interviews, etc. But there's limits to it, right? Because you might just be picking up like snippets of information or general discussion about an attack, but not the specifics of like who necessarily is going to be targeted, when they're going to be targeted, who's going to be involved in that. But they certainly would use electronic intelligence like bugging cars, also bugging premises, etc. But also the IRA and Sinn Féin, who obviously have infiltrated partly as well with Dennis Donaldson case shows, they'd be aware of that to an extent. They do, you read about things in memoirs or Republicans say like you're talking gardens, not necessarily in buildings, be guarded what you say, sometimes pass notes instead of speaking, etc. So the ways around that. And the last kind of thing you had is like interceptions of communications, to be that like letters. I was going to say like in the olden days, but you know what I mean. And then more kind of modern like mobile technology and that intercepting that once you get into the 90s. Certainly there's a book, or Richard Aldrich's book, I didn't think it is. I could be wrong on that. About GCHQ, so like telecommunications interception intelligence for the UK. Yeah, there was also like transmitters. One was in around the South Armagh area, I seem to recall. There's one in North Wales because I live in Wales, so I found this interesting. I swear there was one in North Wales as well. But anyway, so that'd be like intercepting telephone calls, etc., etc. I mean, again, at the same time, and maybe something we'll dive into later, like the IRA would have counterintelligence measures related to some of the electronic intelligence. So it can partly gives you a sense, certainly when I was studying this, that what the British intelligence would call is human intelligence, or like informers and agents, etc. That was pretty crucial. And I think that's probably still the case, now with intelligence services around the globe. It's not all about electronic intelligence and drones now, etc. Human intelligence is key because, as you said, it can just give you more information about the what, why, when. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I spoke to Ian Hurst. I had like a good like 3 hour interview with him, and he went through some of the cons and pros of like electronic methods versus human. I mean, obviously, an electronic um type of communication can't lie to you. It doesn't have its own motives and blah blah blah, but also it can't provide context. Yeah, there's a lot of things like that. I remember reading that obviously because this conflict spans like 3 decades and 3 decades of like technological ramping up, so by the time like kind of mid 80s onwards, they were able to use like a lot more electronic stuff, and a lot of the IRA guys were still stuck in the kind of mentality that if some information got out, it must be a person, it has to be a person. So there was, I remember reading about cases where there was like just a hidden camera in a car pointing at a gate, and everyone, and it must be a rat, it has to be a rat, but in reality it was literally just some camera that was left there. Yeah.
Yeah.
um okay, I was going to ask you, the book is broken up into like 3 sets of years. You might take us through kind of what they are and the reason for breaking them up as such.
Yeah, sure. So like three main sections, as you say, and I think essentially what I was trying to look at is to what extent did British intelligence and intelligence activity, informers, etc., help drive towards the IRA towards ceasefires during the conflict. So, and when I say ceasefires, I mean kind of the major substantial periods of cessation of IRA activity. So the kind of first period you've got is between 1969 up to June, July 1972. So June 1972, the IRA observes a cessation alongside British forces at that point as well, interestingly, as a point in the conflict, because it has talks in London with in secret with the Northern Ireland Secretary of State. At that point was under Edward Heath's government and was a guy called Willie Whitelaw, who's an MP. So that's the first period. And then what I was quite keen to do to look at this topic in more detail and depth is have a look at the IRA's geographical heartland. So what you're dealing with there is like its primary urban centres of activities of Belfast and Derry, and then your kind of more rural town slash countryside activities, so places like South Armagh, East Tyrone IRA, but in County Tyrone more generally, Fermanagh, etc. And then also looking at the IRA's campaign in England, which pops up more post 1972. That does pop up post 1972. And yeah, so the idea with that is, having a look in that first period, is there evidence to show that British intelligence has an effect on the IRA being driven towards the cessation June, July 1972? And like my answer to that was no. I think it has absolutely no influence on that at all. And I don't think that's particularly like controversial, even in academic debates and literature, and beyond that with journalistic accounts, because the IRA at that point was seen to be, growing in strength, growing in ferocity of what it was doing. That's partly why the British government spoke to them, because they'd run out of options to try and alleviate what was happening in the conflict at that point. And then the second period looks from the breakdown of the IRA ceasefire July 1972, and then it goes up to the end 1975, right up to 1975, and including all of that year. And it kind of starts by looking at, okay, if it's not intelligence factors that leads to the ceasefire in June, July 1972, then talks about, and just building on the first section, what did lead to those talks, but also what led to their breakdown. And so the next period, this kind of big second section of the book, looks at, again, what was the impact of British military and intelligence strategy against the IRA up to 1975. And that's where there is more of a debate. There's certain scholars and authors who are saying that, yeah, the IRA is pressurized into 1975 ceasefire out of desperation. Largely, they're saying because of like infiltration of the IRA in Belfast. That tends to be the central kind of crux of their argument. And then, so I looked at that again, that those geographical heartlands, Belfast, Derry, South Armagh, Tyrone, Fermanagh, and then also the IRA's campaign in England, which pops up in this period as well, after the Old Bailey bombing onwards. And for me, again, I didn't think it had a significant impact on what the IRA was doing in terms of going to a cessation. And for me, the cessation was more because the British government started to think about options to, in a sense, withdraw in some form from Northern Ireland, not in terms of like Irish unification. And in some respects, I think they tried something quite innovative. They noticed that, Protestant loyalist paramilitaries plus DUP plus most of the UUP pulled down the power sharing experiment in 1974. So instead, that the British government had this idea, well, look, loyalists and Republicans might agree to like an independent Northern Ireland or part of the Commonwealth. So it's quite a clever idea. And you can see why the IRA would engage leadership-wise in the ceasefire, because they said, well, you know, the war's ongoing. There's no guarantee it's going to stop. It's already stuck in a kind of stalemate situation, which has positives to the IRA in the sense of not pushed into ending their campaign, but obviously has negatives that, yeah, but what have you got to show for it? What's on the table in terms of an outcome? And you know, for them that, and it was interesting, you see in like Irish government files at this point, you know, the Irish government notes themselves, this is something they're dead against because they think it will lead to an island-wide civil war because there'll be discrimination in the north if the British leave. Loyalist units will just implement more discriminatory measures once the British are gone. This was their argument. But the Irish government did admit, from a Sinn Féin and IRA perspective, yeah, it does fulfill the point that you could sell leadership-wise to the grassroots. British government's gone. So British government has withdrawn. Even it's just that you can't have a unification because loyalists and unions won't accept it. So you have to put up with something else in the meantime, like independence of Northern Ireland or being in the Commonwealth, like Canada or something like that. But anyway, so that's that period, and then we then go into the latter period about breakdown of the ceasefire. It doesn't work. I can talk about that later if you want to in terms of reasons for that. So this third section of the book looks at, yeah, so what's the strategy of the British government then, in a sense, for the rest of the conflict? And the chapter that starts that third section of the book says, yeah, under not just Margaret Thatcher, the Labour government at the end of the 1970s also thought, we're not going to talk to the IRA again, and we're just going to ignore them and hope either they just get bored and go home, or that there'll be, you know, they don't have enough political support or influence, so they'll have to, you know, put the guns away and then come on board with a settlement they don't actually have any real influence on. So something called, like, you know, trying to produce this acceptable level of violence, which the British government was trying to do most of the conflict. So you try and, it's a quote in the British Army's post-conflict report about, you try and have normal political, social, economic life as normal as possible. And that was the aim. And just to stop the IRA and Sinn Féin influencing what's happening in politics and everyday life. And yeah, and then obviously we know the IRA settles in for a long campaign itself, declares its long war. There's different interpretations of that. The one I give in the book, which is similar to a colleague, Neil O'Doherty, is actually for the leadership, it was about persisting until you get back to the negotiating table. So it talks about that. And then we have a look at, yeah, what goes on in the intelligence conflict, who fulfills what they were trying to achieve. So again, looks at Belfast, Derry, South Armagh, Tyrone, various other rural areas in that point, like North Armagh as well, and bits of what was going on in County Down. And of course, then looking as well about the IRA's campaign in England, and a little bit about Libyan weapon shipments as well, which has been quite seen as a quite key argument about how far the IRA was infiltrated. And then in my view, I don't think it was significant. I think the IRA aimed to persist, and that's what they did. So the difference for, you know, what changed in the 90s was that the British government, alongside the Irish government, SDLP, unionists as well, as recognised that Sinn Féin and the IRA have too much like community support and a sizable minority of the electoral mandate in the north. So if you want peace, you can't ignore these people. You can't do it because you're not going to get peace. Yeah, so that's kind of the outline of, you know, the key factors I felt led to peace. And obviously the various chapters in that section of the book, third section, looks at some of the standout informer cases. You know, that we know there's publicity around, like the steak knife business, Donaldson, etc. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, the structure of the book was excellent. It made it quite digestible. And going back to the 72-75 section, there was an interesting theory that you floated there. And it was as to why Derry, being an urban area, and wasn't as badly disrupted by the Intel War as Belfast was. It was a very interesting theory you put forward.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting question. And essentially, like, Derry makes changes quite early on, and we see this in accounts by, for example, Shane Paul O'Doherty now, who's against the provisional movement, but at the time was a member of that organization. But we can see this from other sources, like cross-referencing as well, like what's going on in tax, other academic accounts, etc. And essentially, he makes the case that actually after Operation Motorman, so that's basically where the British forces start clearing barricades in parts of Belfast, like West Belfast, and obviously in Bogside, etc. as well, and what the Republicans had as Free Derry. And quite quickly, and not that they were forced to do that, which to an extent the Belfast IRA was. When the Belfast IRA slimmed down its structure, so originally has, which the IRA had from the 1920s, like brigade, battalion, company. So you'd have quite a few people within the IRA, certainly in the companies. I think various Republicans said to me, you might have 20 people, 30 people in different companies, and there'd be various companies, within battalions of their organization. But the problem is with that in the city, particularly in Belfast, was that like if you had 20 people operating, if one becomes an informer and you're constantly doing operations, how are you going to work that out? And the intelligence services, and again, Republicans and people linked to British security forces, etc., both confirm this. That what they would sometimes do is like arrest 15 of the people, then release like 5. One of them is the informer. So Republicans could never work that out. It was very, very difficult at that period to work that out. So that's why Belfast. I think this happened again before 1975, and what the evidence is suggesting to me from various sources, again, Republicans, British intelligence, etc. So Belfast did begin to break down to the cell structure. So cell structure is different in the sense that you mix people from different areas. So you wouldn't just have like everyone in North Belfast companies. This time you might mix people from West, North Belfast, etc. Much smaller numbers as well. Like some people, the estimates vary, but they could be in, say, Belfast and one IRA cell. Maybe over to 1975 might be between like 4, 8 people. Sometimes could be more, but some of these people would just be doing support or supplying weapons, etc. But the key thing with that is obviously it allowed you to then, if things were going wrong in terms of from a Republican or IRA perspective, you could start then to do like a process of eliminations. You'd leave people out, and if the operation works, then you think, okay, so the people involved might not be informers. You bring the person who's suspected back in, the operation fails, and for the IRA, that was some kind of proof that the person was informing. But the interesting thing with Derry, go back to your question, so it's not a long-winded, totally long-winded answer, but back on Derry is they didn't really have that issue pre-1972. And when you go back to, why was Operation Motorman to clearing the barricades happening, the Bloody Friday and the IRA attack in Belfast, and that allows you to see in British government papers, they were kind of like, great, now we can remove the barricades. We've got an excuse and a setting and context to do that. But we have to remember that, of course, there wasn't a Bloody Friday in Derry. That didn't exist. They're the same thing. So what that meant was, and from what we can see, is a lot of Republicans and active IRA members might cross the border into places like Donegal. And what we're getting from people like Shane Paul O'Doherty's account is a couple of people are handpicked to go back and operate smaller cells and essentially do that on the run consistently in places like the Bogside, Chantallow, etc. in Derry. And just try and put pressure on the security forces in that way. And what we can see, including in accounts like Shane Paul O'Doherty, but also people like a guy called Alan Barker's released a book about working in the special branch, but also working in the IUC in Derry around that specific period. And he said it was really difficult, in terms of trying to get on top of the Republican movement in that area. So the smaller cells we can see, they cause disruption in Derry. And Derry's interesting because, as I said, that wasn't something I got the impression they were forced into doing because of like significant problems with infiltration in their previous structure. They decided, and if you like, to proactively do that, and it succeeded quite well in that sense for their unit being able to carry out attacks. So definitely by the time you get to the ceasefire, I don't think at all the Derry IRA is pressured into it.
Interesting, very good. You might take us into some of the reasons why it was much easier for the British security forces to infiltrate the urban units as opposed to rural. It's increasingly. It's like increasingly an area that I'm finding very fascinating, the kind of rural versus urban, how the rural brigades were actually able to kind of like develop and flourish in a way that the others weren't, just given kind of their location and various factors which you went into. I'll be interviewing Toby Harnden, who you quoted quite a bit. Tell us why it's generally easier to infiltrate these urban units as opposed to rural.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I don't necessarily think this is something that is unique to this context on the island of Ireland. I think it could be the case also when we look at different conflicts and paramilitaries elsewhere. I think if we look at urban areas to begin with, so even with the cell structure, the issue for the IRA was in the cities that it's more chance. Like I remember someone used to work for the British Security Services used to say that you could have a lot more like nosy neighbours in places like Belfast and Derry. So people who can just be looking out their window or on the street, wandering around, keeping an eye on people. And you know, and anyone would know from any rural area, it'd be the same in parts of like, I don't know, rural Wales. People are suspicious if you like going wandering up to someone's farm to see what they're up to. Like that generally is pretty suspicious. So that made a difference in the cities. It was easy to recruit people in that way. What was interesting as well was that for like surveillance on IRA cells, like Raymond Gilmore makes an interesting point in his work, which was that he didn't specifically say this related to rural areas, but when we talk more about rural areas in a minute, you're dealing with often like friends, family, people that were quite tightly knit in a Republican community in that area. I mean, if you remember, like not so much South Albar because you're almost dealing with almost 90% plus nationalist, and then you'd have a core sizable support of republicanism within that. But in places like Tyrone, obviously, and Fermanagh, you still have quite a sizable unionist minority in those populations. They weren't the majority of the population from partition onwards, but they were a sizable minority. So you've already got, if you like, potential surveillance from that side of things on your units. Then, of course, you know, within the nationalist community, there's going to be SDLP support, which is going to be, you know, meaning that Republicans are drawing from a certain smaller community overall. In the cities, so what I'm saying related to that in rural areas is that most people would know each other of some form and have contact with each other. So that, to an extent, might put some more inhibitions on informing. And the way I'll explain it is this: that it's interesting in contrast, like Raymond Gilmore says in the cities, not just about the nosy neighbor business. He also mentions about, you know, he was quite young at the time when he had infiltrated the IRA and was in one of their units in Derry. And he was mixing with people who are 10 years plus older than him. So we made the point, even just on a surveillance point for the intelligence services about informers, it didn't take that much to work out if a 19-year-old and a 35-year-old who aren't connected, that might well be because they're in the same IRA cell unit. So he said things like that made a difference in the cities. And I think the other thing there is, on the one hand, I can see with the cell structure, you mix people from different areas. In theory, that means they won't know necessarily the ins and outs of every Republican in, I don't know, like West Belfast, if they're from North Belfast or South Belfast, which is true. But Gilmore also gave the, you know, in his case and other cases kind of verified this, that you might be less inclined to have inhibitions about informing because of the fact that you don't actually know these people and, you know, like a kind of day in, day out business. So that makes a difference. I think also in cities, you know, a lot of British intelligence security was saying there was a, well, they and Republicans had this like posters up about, you know, the dangers of like what they called loose talk in pubs and clubs. It's not that that didn't exist necessarily in the countryside. It's just that, I mean, partly you had the border, so you could escape across the border, and that's not. I don't think in the countryside, you know, sometimes you get from British security intelligence, oh, the Gardaí elapse, the Irish government doesn't do anything. I don't think it's that so much. I just think it's the fact that they don't have the resources and budget that the UK state had and was throwing at Northern Ireland. So, you know, actually, like Republicans would say, and I've said in interviews, like the Guardian were tough if you got caught in the Republic. They weren't soft at all on cross-border activity, but it's a resources issue. And, you know, the British government struggled to deal with 300-mile plus border, and they had plenty of resources to throw at it. So the Gardaí with less, and the Irish Army with, you know, much less finance provided to them by the state, they're not going to be able to deal with that kind of level of activity. So that would make a difference. And I think that, yeah, in countryside as well, and South Armagh would be a specific example of this, that they seem to have a process in place there. And again, people from various sides of the conflict and British archives, we can see verifying this, of, I wouldn't say like trialing people out, but ensuring people were committed, not putting them into kind of frontline IRA activity unless they felt they were trusted and they were ready to do so. So what I mean by that is that, like, there's a quote in the book, one Republican mentioned to me that someone on the run went to South Armagh and South Armagh IRA asked them to watch some helicopters landing. And so the person goes and watches it and then comes back and says, I think the helicopter, from like descent to its landing took about somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds. And they're like, that's not good enough. What is it? Is it 10.1 seconds, 10.2? So there's a level of detail and attention to detail in South Armagh. And the thing is, because you had that attention to detail, it meant less people were getting arrested. If less people are getting arrested, there, and again, most Republicans would resist this, but there might be one or two, not specifically in South Armagh, but other areas that might, provide information after interrogation or break under interrogation. But if you're not being interrogated because you're not being arrested, then you kind of partly solve that issue. And what that meant is you had people who were kind of like veteran Republican operators, if you want to call it, in places like that. So that made it more difficult. But I think as well in countryside areas, and it's not like, I'm cautious of this because it's not the case that people in the urban areas like Derry and Belfast are more likely to cross each other up, etc. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think the border factors I talked about would have been key. But the other thing is, if you again take places like South Armagh, but also like Tyrone and Fermanagh, when we talked about them to begin with, all three of those areas were majority nationalist from the time of partition. So I think there was a long-term dormant tension about being pushed into unionist state without consent in the 1920s that would have, again, made people reluctant to pass information and not willing to British security forces, etc. Also, obviously, what happened with civil rights movement discrimination, like it generally was, they said, like west of the River Bann, there's a scholar, White, I can't remember his first name, but he said that like the discrimination was much worse left or west of the River Bann in the north. And essentially that's because if you look at like Tyrone, Fermanagh, South Armagh, the nationalist majority areas, so if the unionists wanted to control local politics and councils, they, in their heads, they had to discriminate to make sure they stayed on top. Because if things were leveled out, then that wouldn't happen because there was a majority nationalist population in those areas. Anyway, so what I'm saying is you've got that as a background in some of these rural areas. Plus, then you got British security forces coming in. Internment would have affected some of these areas. Local people interned. Some of them might have worked, as an example, I think in County Tyrone, someone was a school teacher, so they were quite well known in the local community. So that's going to cause anger. And then obviously people would see other events like Bloody Sunday, etc. But there were also local incidents, like there was, I remember top of my head, a guy called Eamon McDavitt, County Tyrone, who was hard of hearing, and he was shot by the security forces. Like, again, that pissed local Republicans off and nationalists. And South Armagh, obviously, because of the checkpoints were set up, and it's same across the border, cratering roads, disrupting local travel. Even if the security forces said, well, we have to do this to disrupt the IRA, it was still massive inconvenience for local people. And you even see, like, in some of my chapters in South Armagh, you've got people who support the SDLP. So they're not anti-Sinn Féin and anti the IRA. But say, like, the British security forces, in their view, in places like South Armagh, were going around harassing people, full stop, like whatever their background was. Okay, so why I'm telling you this is because I think this makes a big difference to also why you're not getting that level of like infiltration in places like South Armagh, because people who might have been against the IRA there certainly were not going to pass information generally to the security forces because they was disrupting and harassing their everyday life. And like a classic example of that, a guy called Fergal Caraher, who was a Republican, was shot dead. I think it was in 1990, top of my head, in South Armagh. And essentially, the British Army units involved say, well, we asked them to stop at a checkpoint. They drove their car straight at us, so we shot him. Republicans disputed that and said he was summarily executed. What's really interesting is in William Matchett's book, he quotes an IUC personnel saying there that when any security force member was killed in South Armagh, pretty much no one came forward to give information. And he said when Carragher is killed, loads of people are coming forward, including people who aren't Republicans. So the reason I'm giving that as a context, again, it's because it gives us a sense of like why people in these areas were not going to pass information. And that's partly because of the behavior at times of the security forces, isolated them from people. You'd have that to an extent in Belfast and Derry as well, but there are obvious factors at Belfast. So you don't have the border option in terms of escaping after attacks. And also, in the cities, we should say as well, like, again, which you pointed out at the beginning, it's not just your informers, you've got your helicopters up, you've got your CCTV, and once you remove the barricaded areas, it's difficult for the IRA to operate and move around in those uh, city locations. So yeah, so there is some difference between the two, and I think that and then like factors in the countryside, as we said as well, like the landscape and the fact that if you got your nosy neighbors, how are they going to provide information like without being caught out? It'd be so obvious in a rural area to do that. and and even the fact, like, again, I'll give you one more example in South Armagh. Raymond McCreesh, who died on hunger strike, I seem to remember, I hope I got that right. And again, it's interesting, in one SCLP person's memoirs, they say that this was like the local community in South Armagh saw that as like a tragedy. That's not something that was unique to Republicans. And I think I seem to remember they said, he was doing when he was younger, like a paper round or a milk round, something like that. So local people from Nash's community knew him. And I think that is, that must have a difference in terms of what's happening with the infiltration, because you've got links and bonds to people. You might disagree with their political perspective, but you're from the same community background. You've both had the same experience, like the civil rights things, nationalists and Republicans from places like South Armagh terrain. So I do think that makes a difference. In terms of infiltration.
Actually, on the note of South Armagh, this I read in the book, and it seemed so obvious after I read it, but I hadn't thought of it before. Was the fact that obviously it got to the stage where they couldn't patrol the roads at all because it was so dangerous. And if you can't patrol the roads, then you can't make the initial contact with someone who might become an informant, like the initial hello, and then you're okay. That person in that house is a bit friendly. We can possibly work them into. If you can't patrol the roads, you just can't make that contact at all. Like.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and again, William Matchett's book, obviously we have a different opinion overall about the conflict, but what is interesting in William Matchett's book, he says that about South Armagh. He said the reason the IRA were partly so powerful there is because the IUC couldn't do its everyday policing, and part of that is asking, knocking on doors, asking if people had seen things, etc. Now, in fairness, that wouldn't be different to West Belfast and, again, like the bog side, etc. That is similar. But the difference is, there's enough other people in those city areas who didn't support the IRA and Sinn Féin that you can get information from those people. But in South Armagh, because you're dealing with essentially a hostile population to the British security forces, and in my view, because of things the British security forces have done or not done in terms of the government and civil rights and its approach to that in the 60s into the early 70s. Yeah, that made a difference. So I think that's key. Yeah, I do think that's key.
I was going to say another thing about the border and being able to flee over it and avoid arrest is you don't need to, they didn't need to like replenish the ranks quite as much as some of the urban guys did. And then that has this knock-on effect that you have more experienced guys there and they can kind of mentor the younger guys and build it up. It's almost like it's something that would apply to like any management structure, like be it, guerrilla thing or not.
Yeah. And I think that it's an interesting question because like the IRA operating in England had this debate at various times that if you have people who are experienced in South Armagh, again, it goes back to that thing about not being able to patrol the roads, etc., on foot. Vehicle patrols because of roadside bombs, basically from the early 70s. So you can do it on foot, but you need significant support and be helicoptered in and out, etc. But the important thing there, as you said, is that in South Armagh, because you have the experienced operators and to an extent the IRA control the ground, if you like, that it's going to be very, very difficult to get infiltration in that way. And also it meant, you have a danger, as various Republicans said to me, about when you have experienced operators. On the one hand, and this particularly applied for operating in England, they have expertise, so they're probably more likely to do what needs to be done in terms of an operation and potentially get away with it. The problem is, outside a place like South Armagh, if they've already been in prison or interned, they're probably already known. Well, they are already known, and they're probably under surveillance. But the issue is, of course, you bring in sometimes, like Jerry Bradley in his book about the IRA referred to these people as like green lights, people who have not been picked up by intelligence services or intelligence services, security forces before, and then like arrested, interned, imprisoned. They don't have that record, but then do they have the expertise to like carry out attacks successfully and get away with it, and in a way that doesn't necessarily endanger themselves, etc. And again, in places like not just in the north, like Belfast, etc., but also in when they were operating in England, that was a bit of a thing that the Republicans had to weigh up in terms of being able to carry out their attacks, etc. Yeah.
Good. And we kind of touched on it there earlier, but can you take us through some of the technological changes that that ended up shaping and affecting the conflict in different ways? I didn't know the one about the body armor and the British Army deaths were reduced quite a bit because of it. I didn't know it was because of that.
Yeah, so the body armor, particularly in the cities, so they just made it more, in terms of the security forces, more difficult to penetrate with low range weapons. So the problem for the IRA is then once you get into the 80s and 90s, okay, so they certainly have weapons that could kill more security force members in the cities. The issue is for the IRA at that point is you're on the risk of more civilian deaths in those attacks, because if you start using heavy weaponry in a built-up city, yeah, you're going to end up with more civilian casualties. We can see that from conflicts around the globe in different periods. That would definitely happen. So yeah, therefore they had to be careful, because again, they didn't want to, you don't want to be killing other nationalists and Republicans, for example, that could affect Sinn Féin's vote in places like Belfast or Derry. And so that was really important, and that would have been an innovation. So I think that, like, for me, that was a key alternative reason. Well, why does the IRA's campaign decline in intensity in terms of like deaths of soldiers and deaths of IUC officers, places like Belfast and Derry? And I didn't think infiltration was key here. I think the technological advances alongside the political factors are really important. And that restrained what Republicans could do. The Derry factor as well, like Nilodox, he talks about this in his book, Civil Rights to Armalites, about Derry at the beginning of the Troubles. Good little book. And he makes that point, once discrimination is ironed out and you get the SDLP changing the name London Derry City Council to Derry City Council, trying to rebuild the city centre, the IRA couldn't bomb the city centre again, because they're basically at that point potentially bombing people who could potentially be Sinn Féin voters because they're from the nationalist community. So that, in that sense, there was just kind of a wind down of the campaign in Derry City. The IRA, if you'd like, in the early 70s, when they regularly bombed the city centre out, they'd made their point, and they couldn't afford to do that against the SDLP. So that would have been key with the technology there. Obviously, in the countryside, you get in places like South Armagh, these watchtowers, they stick up British government and British security forces in the mid-1980s. Like, in theory, and again, if people are interested in this, you can read like Operation Banner reports, the British Army's post-conflict reports online. If you type it in, somewhere like Google, you'll find it. And, the watchtowers, in theory, when you read them, seem quite impressive, that they'd have a good surveillance capacity in terms of latest technology, cameras, etc., to watch over the border. And the idea was, yeah, you give the IRA and South Armagh less places to hide. They want to carry out some hit and run attacks. But essentially what ends up happening, and I think the Operation Banner report, top of my head, it's a while since I read it, does admit this itself, that they just found dead ground where the towers didn't cover, or they knew on days with certain weather, fog, etc., yeah, you could get away with those types of attacks. So again, there were some innovations. Whether the watchtowers helped, I'm not convinced they particularly did. The South Armagh IRA found a way around. The other thing about the watchtowers is that and again, I think the British Army's post-conflict report, top of my head, says this, it just basically really pissed off local people. And it played into this narrative again that for Republicans about, the British Army was an occupier, and having like armed fortresses up on the hills constructed wasn't great in terms of playing down that narrative. And it's interesting for me at the moment, actually, because of I'm writing something about decommissioning weapons with the IRA. And you see this like in South Armagh, and I'm talking now like 99, 2000, 2001 as years, local people demanding for Adams and McGuinness and Republican leadership, like, we need those, get them down, those towers, because of what it represents, like I said. So yeah, I don't actually think technological advances in that sense, I don't think were particularly helpful either in the local area. I mean, I don't know, if you ask some people, ex-security personnel, they might tell you some things I don't know they were doing. But certainly, it definitely didn't win any hearts and minds there. And I don't think it significantly disrupted the South Arm IRA anyway. They found ways around it. Yeah.
Interesting. You might tell us a bit about the tasking coordinating group, this kind of umbrella group for the various intel collecting agencies. I remember like before really kind of getting into the topic of the troubles and intel and stuff. I remember it's very easy to think of like the security forces or the intelligence forces as like one block. So like if one kind of member of that block gets a piece of information, that everyone does, but in reality it was nothing like that whatsoever. There's human ego, there's not wanting them to take credit for my work and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think so task and coordinating group, as you said, it was an attempt really like once you get into the 80s to try and kind of circumnavigate some of these tensions between the intelligence agencies. And just for listeners slash viewers, that when we go through that, I mean, essentially you had all these different intelligence agencies operating. So you had like MI5 would be there largely helping with electronic intelligence, like providing bugging, etc. From what I understand, they had a few agents, but nothing particularly significant that I know of, or we publicly know in the public domain that we know of. The main like agent running capacity was done by IUC Special Branch, so the police special branch, and in theory they collated the information, like they held the information. That's different now because of post conflict related to Northern Ireland, so on like dissenting Republican groups, etc. That's routed by MI5, so it's a bit different now. But used to be, in theory, routed the information database, if you like, whereas held was with IUC Special Branch. But at the same time, the British Army had its own intelligence units, so like the Force Research Unit is one example of that. And then it had something as well called, there's various different names, there's like DET or 14 Intelligence. And again, they were more surveillance based, but they would have been, all these organizations would have been involved in these tasking and coordinating groups. And the idea was to bring together like expertise to try and share information and disseminate it in a more coordinated way. And the reason I think they needed to do that was because, yeah, and I saw this when I was like reading through memoirs, you look through state papers and also interviewing people. There were definitely tensions, particularly between any army intelligence units and the IUC Special Branch. And this basically arose because the IUC Special Branch attitude was the army intelligence quite lax at times of how, like, protecting informers, protecting the source, etc., as they would have put it, because of the fact that some of the army, and including army intelligence personnel, weren't there. They were doing like tours and they were there for a certain kind of short period of time. So that put your informers at risk, etc. On the other hand, the army felt personnel that I spoke to, generally have okay relations, they would say, with the IEC Special Branch, but felt the Special Branch quite secretive and wouldn't necessarily share things, and maybe for the reasons we just said. But also, they said the army felt, well, we needed to have our foot in the game trying to recruit informers, because the way some of them phrased it to me was that there were nationalists or Republicans who would not provide information or inform for the IEC Special Branch because of the whole stuff about civil rights movement and what happened involving the IEC Special Branch, etc., who they saw as against that. So they might provide information to the army. But yeah, and in a sense, you can see this in, say, for example, the Finucane review called the De Silva Review came out, I think it was 2012, by the government. It's one of these private reviews rather than a public inquiries they were supposed to do on it. And yeah, you can see in there were tensions between different agencies, and that's why we ended up partly with tasking coordination groups. But even then, it didn't seem to like totally evaporate in terms of these tensions existing. So, and obviously, some of these groups had success. Like I'm pretty sure like Ian Phoenix used to work for IUC Special Branch, and his memoirs or diaries, whatever you want to call them, they were involved in the local ambush against the East Tyrone IRA, where a number of the East Tyrone IRA were taken out, trying to ambush the barracks in Lockall. And yeah, so they did have successes, but I don't think, again, chatting to IUC or Special Branch and British Army intelligence, again, they were of the opinion as well that these problems weren't ironed out. through the entire conflict. And we can see, you know, that's a really interesting point. I mentioned post-conflict. We know this because it was in the Rosemary Nelson inquiry report. There was the lawyer was killed in what was thought to be suspected, and I'm pretty much seem to remember the report said that suspected collusion attack in 1999. And yeah, that's why MI5 rooted everything afterwards. It was a change because they felt that there wasn't a central, if you like, database where people could just pop in and out to get the information they needed. So if you like now, from what I understand anyway, unless it's changed, you know, the police, the PSNI, so the Police Service Northern Ireland Special Branch, they'd have to go to MI5, you know, to get information out of that database, if you like, in terms of collated things. But that tells us itself the fact it changed. The system didn't work that well because otherwise, I'm in the troubles, you know, in terms of all the conflict. Otherwise, you know, PSNI Special Branch would have still kept the information, right, as the central database, but they obviously felt, yeah, that didn't work too successful.
Interesting. I won't keep it too much longer. Given that you've done so much research into it, you produced an excellent, very dense, very information heavy book. I mean that in a good way. I think people who are into like long form content want more details, you know, so it's perfect for them. Given you've done so much research and so on, are there any kind of prevailing falsehoods or misconceptions or something that you spot that you find most common that people have?
It's a good question. I think, you know, the obvious one to start with for the book is the idea, you know, like British intelligence hadn't put any, well, pressurized the IRA into peace by the 90s. I just don't think the evidence bears that out. And, you know, also linked to that, for three essential reasons, that's what the book says, that I do think the cell structure, it had some problems, like we've said, and the other thing with the cell structure, in theory, people weren't supposed to mix between cells, but if you're sharing the same taxi driver, which was sometimes happening in Belfast and Derry, like there's going to be lapses between how watertight the cells are. Nonetheless, I do think it helped. For me, the Belfast and Derry IRA after 1975, the aim was to persist, and I think they did that to different degrees, and that, in a sense, contributed to the peace process occurring, as including Republicans. So I think the cell structure was important because it did allow the IRA to go through a process of elimination. And yeah, at times they, from what we can gather, McGartland's case, you know, is an obvious example in Belfast that, yeah, and eventually he admits because of the cell structure and only a few people involved, that's why he's eventually worked out by the IRA as he's providing information to British intelligence. So that makes sense in terms of that, you know, there were aspects of the cell structure that actually worked and allowed the IRA to sustain its campaign in the longer term. And obviously in the cities with the steak knife business, that, you know, the fact that Belfast IRA starts blowing up its city centre again in the 90s, clearly that person does not have, or at least at that point, does not have total coverage and not like omnipotent, omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing ability. And I think that's partly for sales. Obviously, then in the countryside, we said these are quite small. The key thing in the countryside, they never altered their units into like cells because they didn't need to. So brigade, battalion, company stuff stayed. They didn't need to do that because they were already quite small little numbers. And with the exception of these Tyrone IRA, where, and we don't really know exactly with this whether it was like an informer, etc., involved there. With that exception, the other rural IRA units persisted, and that included in places like North Armagh, Mid Armagh, South Armagh as a kind of standout example. Fermanagh IRA units that were operating in and out of there. And that was really key because of, for the IRA as well, and partly we said because of the, you know, the secretive nature of these units, but partly because of the links between people, friends and family. The border would have helped as well, made them difficult to infiltrate. But that was really, really key. And I said this in the book because I think there's this misunderstanding that everything hinged on the Belfast IRA. And in sense, to some degree, of course, the Belfast IRA was important because, and as one estimate, one Republican said, it was about 50% of the IRA strength. And that may well be right because of the fact it's in the capital city of the northern state. But at the end of the day, really, I think post 75, we've talked about the Belfast and Derry IRA had limits on what they could do just because of you couldn't be having like repeated Bloody Fridays in the cities, because, and it's interesting with this, even like former IEC special branch people admit this. The Republicans were in the cities by the 80s, 90s were cautious because they didn't want to be killing their own supporters and affecting the vote, etc. in that way. And but in the countryside it's different because of the fact that they had space. See, the risk of, what sometimes in conflicts is termed, I don't necessarily like this term, but what could be termed like collateral damage or civilian deaths, that was much lower in places like South Armagh. So that made the IRA there more, and certainly again, talking to former British security services and Irish Gardaí and Irish Army would say that's partly what made places like South Armagh, in their view, like so dangerous, because of the fact that there wasn't those inhibiting factors. And yeah, okay, there's smaller numbers than Belfast, so they're not carrying out attacks, but all the time. But when they did, as one former British Security Service member said, that you could have a number of people die in one attack from their side, and that made them particularly dangerous. And obviously, we see by the 90s, like Toby Hunden, you said you're talking to, he talks about this in his book, and I think he's right from looking at other sources that, places like South Armagh then, alleged to be involved in some of these activities that went on in England, like quite high-profile things by the 90s. So that shows that actually being secure from infiltration in their own area made them dangerous in other areas as well. And I think the kind of third point that comes out of my book is this idea, like, the IRA leadership significantly infiltrated. So, we can't say that someone on like the IRA's 7-person leading army council might have been, but the evidence to me doesn't suggest that, because the two standout examples are first the IRA's campaign in England, because that's the leadership's handpicking volunteers to be involved in that from the IRA Army Council, along with the chief of staff of the IRA. So again, we'd expect quite significant disruption to attacks. And of course, there were some that, didn't get through, but the standout things like Brighton bombing, Canary Wharf, Manchester bombing, earlier stuff like NatWest Tower bombing, Bishopsgate, etc. That high-profile stuff, or the attack on John Major, also with the mortars in the early 90s, that stuff would definitely have been stopped if, British intelligence could have. It made no sense to, allow informers and agents to allow an attack that targets prime ministers. That makes absolutely no sense. And I think, the units in England were difficult to infiltrate just because of the fact that they're handpicked, they're mixed from across islands. It's not easy to, and I mean the island of Ireland, I should have said that. So that makes it difficult to put people together and trace them. And also, like, they were cautious in England after the early 70s. People didn't go and mix in like Irish pubs and stuff like that, or the Irish community in England, Wales, etc. That was obviously a place where they'd be monitored if they did that. And the other thing we know with the leadership as well, again, with significant infiltration, that the excellent Libyan weapons shipments were stopped, but the other ones have got through. And the reason I think that's significant, because it depends here how we're evaluating what was the IRA trying to do as part of this long war. Was it trying to escalate its campaign to force the British government out via the armed campaign, or more, which is my view from what we can see in archives, partly I've talked about in my book, but since then as well, the IRA leadership, I think, were willing to get back to the negotiating table. In that sense, you need to escalate your campaign. So that type of weaponry they bought in from Libya, and how much they'd already managed to get in earlier shipments, would allow them to do that. And we can see this in, for example, two examples of this, or one specific example, actually, like Christopher Andrews' official history of MI5. Like, he has a quote in there from MI5 archives saying that something along the lines, this isn't a verbatim quote, but something along the lines that, the IRA's now got more weapons than it can actually use. And I think that's an admission by MI5. They knew the type of campaign, this low persistent conflict the IRA were engaged in. So yeah, once you got that level of weapons in, that makes it difficult to stop the IRA's campaign via intelligence means or anything associated with that. So I think that goes, that misconception there, it's various misconceptions, but partly, the IRA wasn't all about Belfast at all. And the other thing is, again, that people like State Knife or other informers and agents had a significant impact on the organization. I don't think that's the case. Yeah.
Very interesting. This is the book. I don't know if we said that. I don't know if we said the name before. Excellent. Like I said, if you've listened this far, you'll love it. One last little quick thing. How did you come to a point of being so interested in the conflict and this particular area that you went and produced such? I can only imagine the amount of research that went into it.
Sure, yeah. So I studied it in my undergraduate. I was in London, one of the universities there. And I just think for me, like that specific topic, yeah, we were just reading different articles, and I felt the not total consensus, but there was a consensus view, particularly after you had like the steak knife revelations, early 2000s, and Dennis Donaldson. There was a growing view that actually people were starting to, which was interesting. Like it looked back from the view in the 90s where most academics or journalistic accounts were saying, no, there was a stalemate that led to the peace process, and Sinn Féin and the IRA being on board with that, and the others like British government, etc., unionists, including Sinn Féin and the IRA in the peace process. But then I think the Donaldson steak knife revelation, certainly at the time I was studying, that became quite predominant in a lot of the literature. And again, not all of it, but various parts of it. And I felt there was a kind of growing consensus view. Yeah, they helped to pressurize the IRA into peace. And I think it just goes back to some of the things we talked about and examples of attacks. And I just, from looking at that, it just didn't add up to me. I just thought, well, I'd like to investigate this more because I just can't see, how particularly some of this standout activity. But also when I got looking into it, you almost monthly by monthly, year by year activities in like South Armagh, North Mid Armagh by the 90s, Derry, etc. It didn't add up to me that how come this stuff took place if there was such like heavy infiltration, because surely the intelligence services want to stop that. So I got into it in that way. And then I think the regional aspect in particular was really interesting because probably like most people, if they're studying it and researching on it, you would always, like a lot of conflicts, it's partly the material is always going to focus on the cities and what's going on in the cities just because of like ease of access, etc. But I think that's what I particularly found was interesting, was like the regionalized aspect and understanding the IRA a bit more as an organization, because it's not one of these organizations I found, it's interesting that some armed groups like movements sometimes are loosely coordinated, and that's a bit of a risk for them, because then if there is a decision, okay, we'll have a ceasefire, then you run the risk of quite significant splits in a movement. So it's interesting, like the regional aspect, because the IRA was a centralized organization to an extent. Like it was one, if we were talking about the IRA, we could say in some respects it doesn't matter in like South Armagh, Derry, or Belfast, we know what the IRA is, we know what its ideology is, etc. But what is interesting, it was certainly I felt a significant degree of like local autonomy, and that's interesting. And I found that part of studying it interesting as well, because of like people's experience of the conflict. It's quite different if they were in Belfast, or if they're in South Armagh, they might have a very different, or in Derry even, they have quite different experience. And that makes it quite interesting about it. So in a way, I almost felt that, and also the decommissioning stuff I'm doing at the moment, is you kind of had like mini peace processes across the different areas, because the different areas would need different things addressed to try and end the conflict. So anyway, so that's the background.
So, Thomas Leahy, thank you very much for joining me. Everything you've shared, I'll put a link for the book in the podcast and the YouTube. I'd suggest anyone get it. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, whenever you wrap up the work you're doing on like decommissioning the guns and stuff, that sounds like a fascinating episode to do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that'd be really good. And there's even things that come out there that if some of the listeners and the people watching this wonder, because I always wonder, like, what do they do with the weapons? And it turns out now the documents are only out in the UK National Archives and Irish, up to the Irish one's a little bit ahead actually. I think they're into 2002, but the UK ones are up to, where did I get to? About October 2001, which is of course when there's a first Decommissioning Act verified by the Independent International Commission on Decommissioning by the IRA. So I was wondering, like, what do they do with the weapons? And there's various things been said over the years, but apparently they just cemented over the bunkers. Apparently this is what they did. But it's interesting. So you learn quite a lot about how it happened, and the international involvement's interesting. Like even the fact Cyril Ramaphosa now is the president of South Africa, but he was involved in the inspections of weapons, ANC. So that's interesting as well. You know, some of the people involved in that have gone on to, in his case, be president of his country, etc. So yeah, be happy to do that anytime.